Excellent. I love it when technology works. Hi,
Hey.
I'm joined with Dr. Laura McNally today. I know you don't like being called doctor because, quote unquote, it sounds wank, but
Yeah.
it does make you sound, educated and impressive, and it qualifies your I don't know what you're about to talk to us about with some degree of like professional and academic understandings about
Uh-huh.
about mental health because
Yeah.
everyone's talking about mental health right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, they are. I mean, everyone's talking about everything right now, right? With COVID, everyone's online, everyone's got big opinions. It's all blowing up, like majorly. But I usually wouldn't call myself, I would call myself doctor if I need to, or maybe like on a rental application to sound really legit. But generally, I think medical doctors should call themselves doctor. And then everyone who has PhDs and other kind of doctorates should just call themselves PhD or psych doctorate or whatever.
Oh yeah, okay. It's a nice distinction.
But Americans all call themselves doctor because they're American. So they when they have PhDs, they call themselves doctor. So now that I'm doing more public speaking and stuff, and I'm talking with more Americans, they're kind of like, well, you have a PhD, like you're a doctor. I'm like, yes, but like we don't have to go on about it. So I tend to just not say it.
If I had a PhD, I would definitely be Dr. Hardcore.
That's actually that's not
Like
your real name though.
Hardcore is my legal middle name.
Middle.
Yeah, yeah. So like Hardcore is my middle name,
How
Like
did
yeah.
Wait, did
Uh,
you come up with that?
of course. No, yeah, kind of. It kind of happened organically, to be honest. This is before like personal brands were a thing.
Yeah.
Um, in my late teens and early 20s, I was super into the hardcore scene, style of music out in New York City. I did a
Oh.
radio show in New Zealand at Alternative Station for a long time, like 15 years. And the
Oh.
first show I ever did was called Viva la Hardcore. And
I thought it was about your MMA stuff. I just
Ah,
assumed.
that's what it moved into. So then
Okay.
I became like I was kickboxing and doing Muay Thai, and I had a pretty aggressive style, and I'd always play hardcore music in the gym, and people started, yo, Richie Hardcore is like, and it became like my ring name. And then when I was 26, I thought it would be cool to legally change my name, become a
So
reinvention of self.
cool. I
Now
actually
I'm
think that's pretty cool.
And now I'm 40 and I talk about pornography and it's hilarious because I have to be like,
Mm.
no, I'm not a, I'm not a former porn star because people mix that up sometimes.
Oh, yes, because they think hardcore porn.
I know.
Okay,
So,
right. I hadn't
that's
thought of
me.
that.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't either, but I don't know if you know Melinda Tankard Reist at
Yeah, yeah.
Collective Shout. We did some speaking together in Australia and she checked up on Facebook. Former sex performer Richie Hardcore did a great presentation today, and I'm like, "Yo, sister, all good." Like, but that's not my story.
Former hardcore porn performer. Oh, that's amazing.
So, what
Um,
got you into the study and practice of psychology?
that's a good question. I mean, I jumped straight into studying psychology after high school because I knew I wanted to, because I just thought it was interesting. And the thing about studying psychology is you can't just do a bachelor's, you've got to specialize. So I ended up doing, straight after my bachelor's, I did a master's in organizational psychology. That's pretty interesting, and that's when I moved to Sydney and worked in the consulting field, which is where you're working with individuals and companies who need some kind of. This already sounds boring, just me even introducing it.
I'm
It's
introduced. I'm interested.
nah,
Introduced away.
no, it's boring. It's just providing psychological solutions in the context of an organization. So like a charity, a company, whatever it might be, and they're having issues with their employees or management or whatever it might be. So you come in and find solutions for them, and that could be offering them individual level support, like We often do psychometric testing, give people feedback, then get everyone to sit together and we talk about everyone else's personality profiles and how we can work more effectively, that kind of stuff. And that kind of paid the bills, which meant I could go and do a PhD, which is what I really wanted to do, and I wanted to work out what made people unethical or ethical and how that related to the bigger, broader picture of how the world's kind of developing. What makes a business leader a good person? What makes businesses unethical? But I ended up really looking at the social, political impacts of corporate ethics from more the community perspective.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it was.
What makes someone ethical?
Oh, it's really, really tricky because that's the personality layer you're talking about, the individual person. But when you're in an organization, you're at the behest of all of the politics and the power plays and the systems that keep that organization functioning. So your individual personality might be that you have a strong moral and ethical framework, but it doesn't fit within that company. So it's almost impossible to enforce your values or to live your values, as people would say. And so what I really found more kind of in an overarching way is that a lot of companies' ethics actually came at a cost to the people that they claim to be helping, and also came at a cost to the politics. So, for example, companies would be paying off communities to let them do certain development, and mine wanted to expand or open up a new operation, and they'd say, oh, well, we're going to donate $10 million. It'll be great for everyone in the community. Everyone wins. And what they do is that they then sort of start to play almost like a local government role where they're actually involved in making decisions about roads, schools, hospitals, education. And it's like, okay, now that's not charity anymore. That's actually politics. That's the government's job. So they're actually not only taking over communities, but also taking over local governments. And that's what I ended up finding. And that obviously took me down the road of researching things like sexual exploitation. That's very much caught up in the world of economic development. And I was traveling around the world a few times. And now have kind of landed in the real world because of COVID. I can't keep moving around. So I'm working as a consultant, not as a practicing psychologist. A lot of people think psychologists are always offering therapy and stuff. I don't actually offer therapy to anyone. I offer consulting advice to people and companies that need specific solutions. And I don't actually engage people in therapy, but I am happy to refer people to the right kind of therapy based on what I think suits them.
Yeah, because that's what I thought. Because I see a psychologist and I'm like, yo, homegirl's got all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot to unpack in that answer. I'm actually quite fascinated in. Let's start with sexual exploitation, because I guess that overlaps with some of my professional work and some of my interests. Is that when you're talking about sexual exploitation, are you talking about, say, trafficking in the developed world? Say you go to Thailand and there's brothels and yada, 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 or what was your work around, I guess, was it like stopping sexual exploitation or?
So there's a few things. One is that my research looked at frontier communities, so communities that are on the edge of economic development, and they could be just like a regional town somewhere that doesn't actually have a whole lot of economic development happening. There's only one factory and they're about to open a mine there. Or it could be somewhere where the country as a whole is less economically developed. And that's very common. There's so much primary industry in less developed countries. So, a lot of mining and industrial labor type work where they're, producing clothing and garment factories, or they're mining raw materials. So I was looking specifically at what happens when a company goes in to develop, and what's the flow-on effect? Because we know that people will get jobs out of it, yes, and we know that it will bring wealth to the community, yes, but often with that, there's this second-order effect, which is that domestic violence goes up, sexual exploitation goes up, HIV and other sexual diseases suddenly come out of nowhere. And so it was like, why? And kind of unpacking some of the layers to that. How are companies responding either well or not well to the flow-on effect of their operations in these communities who haven't previously had this company there? And I think the interesting thing was that what I found is that the human rights research was very clear and specific in the sense that people who are poor and don't actually have jobs and don't have economic opportunities are very vulnerable to exploitation in those situations. And interestingly, there was a lot of research from feminist researchers who would say, oh, but, you know, if a woman feels she has a sense of agency, or feels that she might enjoy this at some point, then we can't assume that it's a human rights violation. So there's a huge gap in the two main perspectives in the research. And one is that sexual exploitation is always a human rights violation, and you can put most of the commercial sex trade into that category. And then the other is that, oh, but some people like it, some people choose it. You can't assume what it means. We can't assume it's a human rights violation.
Where do you land with that?
I land on the side of the data, and a lot of people would say, like, oh, well, you don't like the sex industry because you're negative about sex, which is like the craziest response.
Yeah.
Like, no, it's got nothing to do with that. It's got everything to do with what the data says about how people are being exploited.
Yeah, I deal with that criticism too sometimes. I'm told I'm anti-sex work or sex negative, as opposed to sex positive because of my critiques of pornography. But again, it's data that I base my work on and my personal views on. I don't care if you want to sleep with 50 people a week, as long as you're it's fully informed and consensual and free of external drivers of that behavior.
If it's free of coercion.
It's free of coercion, yeah, exactly. Economic coercion or any sort of coercion. But I do care about 13 and 14-year-olds, like, sexually assaulting other 13 and 14-year-olds on school grounds, or you know, the normalization of self-objectification, and that gets sent around a school. That kid cuts their wrists. You know, like, those are the stories you hear all the time. Because kids are recreating the culture which they're drowning in, you know, with no critical filters and no critical conversations. And I've found that often the pushback against that is from people who aren't actually working with young people or working with, you know, people on the ground. You know, like, ideology and academia is great and important, but you need to temper that with, like, real world experience in my understanding of it. You know what I mean?
Yes. I feel like that's why I couldn't continue down the academic path in a lot of ways, because, you know, I kind of come from the real world. I was raised by two people that have regular jobs, not academic jobs. And as my dad would say, like, it's all kind of bullshit. Or you guys are just talking bullshit, off with the fairies. And I'm like, in some ways it's true. And I see a lot of academics do this, where everything's just kind of like a thought experiment to them, because they do live in the world of thought experiments and philosophy, and we can intellectualize and problematize and let's unpack. And it's like, yes, but these are real people's lives. It's not just an experiment. And I think it's happening in all kinds of ways right now. a lot of the debates we're having, a lot of the social media stuff is like, I don't know, there's people taking a lot of academics taking a very strong pro-rioting stance for Black Lives Matter, because in their view, it's supportive of people who have been affected by racism. And it's like, but that's your ideological perspective. That's what you've come to by way of intellectualizing the theory of how people might, and it's not actually based on like how are people on the ground impacted by rioting. If we ask all the people who are impacted by rioting, what would they say? It's not like just an intellectual exercise for them. It's a real problem.
Yeah, this is the other thing with social media. It's all black or white. Like there's no nuance in like a long form conversation. Because I understand, I mean, personally, like I understand why someone might want to destroy something, right? I mean, I understand why years of discrimination and rage and seeing your friends get arrested and stuff leads to violence. But at the same time, I've watched a lot of the videos coming out of the United States over the last few months, and it is people of color in marginalized communities saying like, why the fuck are you here burning down my neighborhood, to like white kids who've got who are like Chuck, like leading to,
because it's a game for them.
The violence. Yeah, those people get to go back to their middle class lives or the upper class lives. Yeah, I've seen some really moving videos of black activists saying, get the fuck out of my neighborhood, stop wrecking shit. Yeah, this isn't a game, as you say. Yeah, and I feel like that academic sort of take on things is, like you're saying, filtering through social media, right? And people kind of get these super strong ideological bubbles that they hang out in, and it's like us and them. And how do you think we change that? Because the algorithm drives people towards being outraged and being furious and taking strong views rather than gentle conversations. Like we talk to win rather than understand these days.
Yeah, that's true. It's really hard too, because... How can we shift that? Well, it's tricky because, a lot of academics' life work is represented in these debates. So as much as I can say like, well, it's all an ideological, it's all just kind of ideas for them, and it's not actually their life, but it's actually their life's work. So they really are invested in winning the debate. But unfortunately, the problem is that I don't think those debates reflect what's actually happening. So when it becomes this, you're either pro Black Lives Matter or you're anti Black Lives Matter, and I think this happens on just about all topics now.
Yeah, any topic. Yeah.
Like you're either all for it or you're all against it. And it's like, I just want to ask questions of both sides. Can I do that? And I think you often get painted black when and I don't mean black as in race or anything. I mean, you get painted as a bad person when you try to sit in the middle and have a nuanced conversation. And that's a psychological thing. And it makes a lot of sense that people do that. I don't know if we've talked about this before, but the psychology of splitting the world up into good or bad is very common.
It's really borderline personality, right?
Yeah.
I was talking to a personal, I'm a personal trainer amongst other things, and I was talking to a couple of my clients who, one's a psychiatrist, one's a psychologist. And I was like, is it just me, or is social media taking this really borderline dynamic, as I understand it, where we split things into black and white and our feelings become facts? And, is that right?
I mean, I think the struggle is that social media rewards that type of behavior. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the people are doing it have borderline. I mean, everyone has little traits that are related to certain psychopathologies. So I'm not saying they're all borderline, but certainly social media rewards behaviors that reflect borderline pathology. So if you do split up the world into good or bad and you just go hard out on social media, like, fuck all those people, they're definitely wrong, I fucking hate them, down with them, do better, guys. People love it. They're like, yes, someone's amped up. They're passionate. Love to see it. And I mean, I gotta admit, I like drama too. I like seeing people argue. It's pretty entertaining. But then afterwards, you're like, okay, that wasn't actually healthy. That was drama. It created heat, but not light. It brought a lot of people into fiery back and forth. But did we actually get anywhere with it? Did we get closer to the truth? Did we unpack anything? No, we just shouted at each other, really. And it felt good at the time, and it feels bad afterwards.
Yeah, I've had yeah, I've had relationships like that.
Yeah, because we're like, oh, it's so passionate. We're all in, and it's fiery, and it's romantic, and then you look back and you're like, oh, that was actually.
What the fuck was that? That was the train wreck. Yeah. Looking back, let's take that back. What is borderline, or what is a borderline dynamic for anyone who's not familiar?
Well, so a lot of people are familiar with narcissism. And a lot of
people think it's used a lot, but a lot of people probably don't really know what it means. I think people confuse like being a bit arrogant with having narcissistic personality disorder, which are quite different things. Do you want to unpack both of those?
Well, they're both tricky. It's funny. Could I just say one thing? I think it's really funny how a lot of people want to identify with having trauma, but no one wants to identify with having borderline or narcissistic traits. It's always someone else that has those. But it's always me that has the trauma. And it's like, all of these are like interrelated. They're not like all of the poor trauma victims who are beautiful, lovely, kind, caring people who've never done said a bad word. And then there's the narcissists and the borderlines. Again, it's the splitting, and it doesn't actually work like that.
Yeah, because if you have a history, like I have to take ownership of the fact that, not all, but I grew up with it's common knowledge of a pretty dysfunctional childhood, and I've had a couple of, not all, but a couple of kind of like dysfunctional relationships, and the common denominator is me, because I have a degree of dysfunction, and we search out things that make us feel like we're back in our childhood patterns, right?
Yeah.
I think it's, I like that you say that. It's always them and not us, but in fact, it's both of us.
Okay, so the traits though, right? So the narcissistic or the borderline traits. I think the thing about narcissism is it appeals to people because we associate lack of empathy with narcissism. So anytime someone does something that we think that's not very caring, that's a bit narcissistic. And lack of empathy is a trait of narcissism, but of course it's not the only thing. It doesn't mean that lack of empathy means you have narcissistic personality disorder. And everyone has minor amounts of some of these behaviors at some point, and it's totally normal. But of course, we've kind of like gone to the far end of the spectrum in terms of trying to pick who's narcissistic all the time. And it doesn't help when like Donald Trump is in power and everyone's kind of saying like, well, Trump's a narcissist, so I'm going to now identify every narcissist I know and make them the enemy, and they're always the bad guy. So, like, I think it's fair to say that Trump obviously does display narcissistic traits. One of them is a sense of grandiosity. So you have this illusion that everything you say is grander than anything else anyone else has ever said. And it's absolutely true and correct. Even if you're proven wrong, it's like, no. What I said is still better. And you can hear Trump do this all the time. He's like, no, I was right. And it's like, we're showing you the facts that you were wrong.
Yeah, I know. He got furious about getting fact-checked on like Twitter and some live debates, huh?
Yeah. Can't handle it. So there's a few things that you see that are common, especially on social media. And I think social media really encourages those traits too. The fact that we have to kind of put ourselves on display and try to be more than we are because we're presenting ourselves to the public, it does kind of encourage this like grandiosity in our thinking. And
do you think can I just ask you a question on that? Do you think that there's like an addictive element to that? Like our dopaminic sort of pathways get fired up every time we get a lot of like social media accolades for our
Mm,
grandiose thinking or our grandiose, like I called this person out. Is there like an addictive element
yeah,
to that?
I there has to be. I don't recall the research on exactly what is happening and exactly when, but for sure the dopamine response cycle is what they build apps around. So, like the colors and the sounds, and every app always wants you to turn notifications on. They're like,
Mhm.
please turn notification,
Yeah.
let us notify. Like, stop. It's because it's the dopamine thing, and it's like the notification might be meaningless, but we still get a dopamine hit just because someone's talking to us. It's that little hit of like something's going on, or someone's validating me, or someone's saying something. And so of course they want notifications, they want sounds, they want as many, they've turned off likes on Instagram, which was a big move. But of course, people are still going to care what their like count is. So it definitely reinforces all the time, like all of these elements of putting ourselves on display and taking a very black and white stance and making our views bigger than they are, and not having space for any nuance. All of those things are kind of rewarded, and unfortunately, I mean, as much as we can call out narcissists, apparently, I think all of us fall into the trap of replicating some of those behaviors when we're trying to build a social media profile. And I understand the value in building a social media profile. It's one of the most useful business tools that's accessible to us right now. And you'd be crazy to run a business and not build a social media profile around your business, because it's the best way, the most direct way to talk with your customers. But I don't know that it necessarily has a good impact on our mental health.
That's interesting. When we're thinking about getting all those rewards from social media and we're thinking about borderline and other sorts of mental health issues or personality disorder issues, it kind of fills that inner void, right? You're like, I'm worth something. I got 1,000 likes today. Or like my inner emptiness has been assuaged because I don't know, someone said my selfie looked hot or like my
Mm.
idea was brilliant. Is that, and do you think a lot of people fill themselves up with social media and it becomes a very real addiction to the expense of their real life? Well, not their, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like it is real life, but their interpersonal connections that are more tangible.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem. I don't know if you've heard or read Johan Hari's
Yeah,
book.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean he talks about this really well, which is the issue that everybody is feeling disconnected because we spend so much less time in face-to-face interactions. And in this sort of disconnection, and especially now with COVID, like everyone's trying to do things online instead of in the real world. And there is this kind of gap. There is this kind of discomfort. And I think a lot of, especially for extroverts, we have a lot of need for social companionship. And it's not virtual social companionship, it's real
Mm.
life social companionship. And so we're trying to kind of fill the gap with like, well, if I just get lots of followers, I won't feel that void anymore. And it's unfortunately doesn't fill anything. And whilst not filling the void, it also traps us in the cycle of we need to build on it. Like if you got 1,000 likes yesterday, you need to try and get 2,000 today. And our brains can't really help but to do that because once we've started getting rewarded by something, we want to keep going. And I don't, obviously some people actually do have a real addiction around their use of technology. But I would say the average person, not at all addicted, but I just don't necessarily think it's helping them mentally. And I think it actually becomes, while we use it as this kind of void filler, it actually creates more of a void. And so the cycle begins.
I've been pretty pumped on Jonathan Haidt's book, Cuddling of the American Mind, and
Mm,
it shows some data which is it's like a trackable rise in the advent of like anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and suicide in young people that correlates with the rise in social media apps and smartphones. What do you think this is doing to people, particularly young people?
It's so tricky. I really liked their book because they talk about how specifically after the iPhone was introduced, how suddenly mental health stats just completely changed. And it's true. It was the age of the iPhone. Everything changed. And yeah, we had some like sort of connected smartphones and Blackberries before that, but it totally changed the world. Being on the iPhone, having a screen to look at yourself all the time and monitor yourself all the time and just constantly and it's really interesting because you see young people do this, and I even did this. They're on Snapchat and TikTok all day, filming everything. Everything gets filmed, everything gets sent to their friends, everything's recorded. Nothing ever really just happens now. And it's interesting because on the one hand, that's how they build social connection now. But then on the other hand, of course, it's not really the social connection that we need. And so I think that has to have something to say when we talk about anxiety, depression, and so on, is that this kind of constant monitoring of self and others in place of what would normally be just kind of play and free time with your friends to just chat. It's all of those dynamics seem to have changed. And I'm not saying people don't just hang and chat and hang with their mates and do that kind of stuff, but it's like there's another layer now because someone's always filming.
Yeah. But that's there's been some like fucking awful stories. Do you remember that story where that girl live streamed on Periscope her friend getting raped?
Oh no.
You didn't see that? This happened a couple of times. You know,
Yeah.
like she quote unquote got lost in the likes. And like her friend was being sexually assaulted, and instead of like calling the cops, she live streamed the whole thing. It was really
People
upsetting.
liking it.
Oh, people were like, the hearts were going up and up and up. Like it got huge views. It was crazy. But then, if we're going back to what we were talking about earlier, and sexual exploitation and yada yada yada, we do live in a very strange culture where hardcore pornography shapes culture.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they didn't know necessarily that girl didn't want. They didn't know that sex was unconsensual at the time. So perhaps they thought it was just a precursor to OnlyFans.
Mm-hmm.
This is 2 or 3 years ago, I think. You should look at the story. It's pretty. The young woman got charged and arrested. I think she got incarcerated too for it. But we do live in a culture where young people in particular have got very amorphous boundaries around sex and consent, and that's through no fault of their own. It's because of what we've culturally normalized, right? Which is sexual aggression and self-objectification. And I'm not saying any of those things are inherently bad, but they need a whole lot of very nuanced, detailed, patient conversations. And I don't think 13 and 14-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 10-year-olds need to be looking at, people getting gangbanged on Pornhub and it's shaping their sexuality.
That's another thing about the social media thing, though, when you're talking about why does social media reward this very kind of extreme black and white, kind of very conflict heavy.
Yeah, conflict heavy. I know it's depressing, right? I'm like, yo, does anyone have like a good day today?
But I think that part of that is that social media is by and large shaped by young people. The biggest users of most of the most popular apps are like in that teen to early 20s age range. So what we see tends to be the patterns that make sense for them. And, when you're in that age range, it is really important that you assert your identity and get people to agree with you. get likes, get popularity, all of those things. They're totally normal when you're a teenager. Like everyone goes through the awkward teenage years where you're trying to find your place, not really sure who you are, you're trying a few things out, trying to see, who's going to like you the most if you do this or that. And everyone goes through these phases. Unfortunately, they're now going through these phases online in front of
publicly.
Yeah.
And it's getting documented forever.
Yeah. And they're getting instant feedback, of course, all the time, which is incredibly anxiety provoking. I mean, I wouldn't even want to think about how it would have been to be 14 or 15, taking photos of yourself, posting them on the internet, waiting to see who likes it. Is it going to be the guy you like? Is it going to be only 2 of your friends and that you'll be so embarrassed? That would be I couldn't even imagine.
Oh, it's bad enough now.
Yeah.
No, so what's the solution? What is the solution to that? How do we stop this kind of train?
Well, I think it's complicated because it's not, I don't think we can ask people to stop what they're doing.
Yeah.
I don't think you can ever tell young people like, that thing you're doing is harming you, so you should actually stop and choose this more boring behavior that's good for you.
That's basically my job. I go in the stores and I'm like, yo, what's up, kids?
It's really tricky. Like, there's obviously value in showing kids that there's other options. Like, you don't have to be involved in the debate. You don't have to post sexy photos. You don't have to send nudes. You have the option to say no. That's great. That's all well and good. But also we need to have like a viable option for people that actually looks compelling. And that's why I think people who are coming out now to offer new, and I don't know much in terms of the kind of conversation around sex, but I just know that with what's happening in politics and the amount of debate and left versus right and how much conflict there's a lot of people kind of emerging in the middle now saying like, let's actually have some intelligent conversations that are not black or white. And that's offering people a third solution.
I like that a lot. I've noticed that there's like this new kind of moderate progressive, because I'm historically I've been a green voter forever and ever, I've put my face in public campaigns around gay marriage, like I've been on the TV supporting gay marriage and stopping family violence, and fucking I've been on a recent television ads around like cannabis legalization and all very progressive things, and yet online I'm not progressive enough for people. No, I'm serious. Like, I've had like horrific things said about me by people I've never met, like critiquing my politics and my personality, or based on like, maybe something stupid I did say, or an old outdated idea I did have, from 5, 6, 7 years ago. I don't know. And I'm like, yo, but okay, like I'll try and do better. But now I'm in this space where I'm like, this isn't like good. This isn't healthy thinking to think like this. And I've been like feeling quite like adrift.
Yeah.
And then I start like noticing people like Aisha Dakambi and other really articulate thinkers who seem to want a better world and a kinder world and a more equitable world, but not at the expense of this othering of people who have different beliefs and cancel culture and all that outrage all the time. It's kind of like giving me like a glimmer of hope. Does that make sense to you?
I think it's really interesting. I don't know who came up with this, but it's like you can't have war with one person. So as soon as one person stops participating in the fight, there is no fight. You need 2 people. You need the both sides. And if someone says, I'm not involved, the fight ceases to have the power that it has. And so I think that in the past, and I don't know at what point this changed, but I do know a lot of journalists and academics who are progressive are now coming out to say this situation is untenable. Like, I'm being cancelled as a progressive
Yeah.
for apparently not being progressive. This is ridiculous. But unfortunately, you can't really win that war. Like, we're never going to win the war of, are you progressive enough? That's not progressive. This is what it really means to be progressive. And we're just going to fight about the definition forever, back and forth, about who gets to win being the most progressive. Like, someone just steps back and says, I'm actually doing a new thing. I'm not participating in this fight anymore. This
Yeah,
is what I
yeah.
believe.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, because you can spend so much time trying to show people how progressive you are instead of
Yeah.
actually doing the work, right?
Yeah.
You're like, I'm not going to be out here doing tangible things with real people, working in the
Yeah.
environment. I'm going to spend all my time defending myself.
Yeah. You can
It's
never
a
win.
you can never win, right? So you might as well just be like, cool, you can do your thing over here. I'm just gonna actually do shit. Do you think
And
that's
do you know what's funny? We were talking about narcissism and borderline traits before, right? And one of the really easy things you will often learn when dealing with people with narcissistic or borderline traits is to never jade them. Jade stands for justify, argue, defend, explain. And
ooh,
so basically, the theory goes, anytime you're dealing with someone with these kind of traits, they're looking to kind of entrap you. And so as soon as you give some kind of explanation of, no, but like, I am progressive and I want to explain myself and here's all the reasons why, you've now just fueled their fire, because you've given them some kind of validation. Firstly, that they had a right to call you out. And secondly, that you now owe them the explanation that you're trying to give them. And then thirdly, that they can kind of hook you in with more questions, with more call outs, with more problems. So as soon as you start going down the jade route, you're actually playing their game and you're no longer looking after yourself.
yeah, this is fucked up though, because I've seen this happen to other people. And so they'll like turn off their comments or they'll block people or they just simply won't respond. And then people take that as some sort of admission of guilt, or they'll use
Mm.
the word like you're silencing voices or whatever. And yet I look at like in New Zealand we have NetSafe, like about digital harm prevention, and that their best practice advice is like disable comments, like
Yeah.
block people vigorously.
Yeah.
So like keeping well, according to the experts and social justice online social justice culture seem to be at odds with one another. Like you just meant to let
Yes.
people give you a
And
tirade. Like that's bad for you to be on the receiving end of that.
yeah, exactly. And I think the thing is, yes, you'll get called out. Let's say somehow one of your posts gets called out and it snowballs and everyone's piling on in the comments, and you turn comments off and they go, oh, well, that just proves it. You've just proven that you are whatever, a bigot. But the thing is, the fallout and the snowball of you turning off comments and ceasing to supply them with data will be far smaller than if you try to jade them and try and bring your defenses in, because every defense you bring is going to be another snowball for them to run off on a tangent with about how it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove you're progressive. We want more data. That's not enough data. We need more examples. That example
Yeah.
wasn't good enough. And so you end up kind of getting, it's like all the tentacles start like taking over of all the things you've tried to use to explain that, like, no, I actually am a good person. They start like trapping you with
I
that
know.
information too.
It's like you need to like viciously self-flagellate in order for it to stop, right? It's like, all right, cool, I'll fucking kill myself. Like,
But
is that what you want?
it's very vicious. And I think one of the helpful things that's happened is that people are now calling out call out culture. So when you see people kind of
Mm.
engaging in this viciousness, you can say, like, that's not necessary. You seem to be doing cancel culture and I'm not going to participate. And it's like given us a little bit of a buyout now to say, I'm not admitting anything. I'm not being a bigot. I'm not guilty. I'm just telling you that you're doing cancel culture and I don't want to play that game.
Yeah,
That's
right.
it.
You strike me as, I mean, I don't know your politics, but you strike me as like a kind of lefty liberal person, but like bitter and pissed off at the way that the conversation's gone. Is that fair?
Um, yeah, that's an interesting one. I don't, maybe I'm like politically agnostic right now, like, not participating. I, I've like lived overseas for a while and I didn't really plan to return to Australia. So I don't keep a particularly close eye on Australian politics anymore. My partner's from New Zealand. He hasn't been here for like 5 years. He doesn't have a clue about politics here either. But of course, I've been writing and involved in public conversation for some time. So it tends to get politicized. But at the same time, I always end up kind of saying like I'm on the side of data. I'm not on the side of politics. I'm not into politics. I'm a pragmatist. I just want to look at what's actually happening and respond in turn to that instead of like, well, which is the best party? Because I don't actually know. Parties often have one great policy on one issue and a terrible one on another issue. So I don't think that necessarily taking a strong political stance of like, well, I'm only for this party necessarily means anything. They could have some incredibly good policy based on data on some things, and other things they claim to be progressive on, but the data doesn't actually stack up.
That is a really difficult place for you to find yourself in. Have you seen that John Cleese video from like fucking 30 years ago or something? And he's like, blah, 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 and moderates. Everyone hates blah, 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 and moderates. It's very funny. Do you know do you know it?
No, but it sounds about right.
I'll find it. I'll send you the video. Because you're not picking a team.
Yeah.
And people want you to.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Actually, not even people, because the voices that you and I are both talking about on like the hateful, men's right activist, racist fucking Charlottesville pieces of shit over here, and then the extremely progressive cancel culture, othering of people who've got a marginally different viewpoint over here, they kind of like dominate the space, and they're like, millions more people who are kind of like, well, I don't really know. They're like,
right. Yeah. That's me. And I am happy to represent those people because I think the silent majority is often much more wise than the loud minority. And a lot of people don't need to yell their views from the rooftop because they're very comfortable and happy with their views as they are. And I think that a lot of like grandstanding on social media is really projecting that kind of discomfort and the sense that you're not really sure, so you've got to yell about it on social media. A lot of people don't need to share their views on social media. They're very comfortable with their views as they are, and they don't have to argue about them on social media.
to give their life a sense of purpose and meaning. I know that's an interesting one, like that recent footage of the woman who was like mobbed by protesters, and she'd been on the Black Lives Matters marches, and she was anti-racist and had been marching alongside the very same people who I would say intimidated her.
In the restaurant.
Yeah, that was upsetting to see. I feel like that's what social media, that was like the perfect visual representation of what social media is these days.
Yeah. And I would say, like, I don't want to pick a team. And actually, ever since I first started writing, that's kind of always been my position. And I've written on a whole bunch of random debates, things that people were debating in Australia, like positions on Islam, and that became like Islam is horrific and terrible and backward, and then no, Islam is progressive and modern and we've got to save it, and my position on all of the debates across the board have always been the same. It's like you're not really focusing on the data. You're not really focusing on the people who are affected by this debate. You're more concerned with your own opinion and standing firm in winning the debate than actually like what's going to help the people that you claim to care about. So if you're debating religion, well, what's going to help most the people who are harmed by religion? Or if it's pornography, what's going to help most the people who are harmed by pornography? Or if it's racism, what's going to help most people who are affected by racism? Because a lot of these debates, I think, completely forget the people they claim to care about, and they just get stuck in trying to end their opponent, trying to win the thing.
Yeah. It's not about being constructive. It's about being seen to be right, which makes me very sad because, I mean, like I was saying to you, like, I am like a politically left-leaning person, like, but I feel like I don't fit in the team. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I am like anti-racist and pro LGBT rights, and these are things that I deeply believe and care about, and know people in the real world who are part of all these different minorities, and I don't want their lives to be worse than mine as like a white dude, you know, because of their identity. But at the same time, the way those conversations are had in the public space make me feel horrible, you know?
Yeah.
I don't want to be part of that. So I'm like, what the fuck, you know? Like,
Yeah.
where do I go?
Yeah. But that's the thing. I think that's the good thing that's happening with how extreme it's becoming, which is very disheartening to see how polarized the world has become right now, and it can be very off-putting, but I think something new is emerging in the middle.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it's kind of like the Buddhist concept, which is the middle way. Like
Yeah.
the solution is always to find the middle way and to not fall into either extreme. And the hardest path to walk is the middle path.
I
There's
like
a lot more
that.
work involved.
That's a good one. The middle path. It's interesting you say Buddhism. Like that's the one great faith that I've always had like an affinity towards, and when I've read books by the Dalai Lama and other Buddhist authors and stuff, it's always like made a lot of sense to me in that I can find my way towards some degree of clarity and peace through my own actions, as opposed to like prostrating myself before God and hoping if I follow the rules that good things will happen.
And isn't it funny that that's kind of what progressive politics is turning into, which is like admission of guilt, confess your sins, say you're sorry, like, prostrate before the crowd.
Have you read that excellent essay, Excommunicate Myself from the Church of Social Justice?
Oh, no.
It's deep. It's by I read it 3 or 4 years ago when I was getting like my first taste of outrage culture.
Yeah.
And someone sent it to me, and I was like, oh my God. Like it really helped me make sense of what I was going through, because I'd never been on the bottom of a pylon before. And it was really weird and confusing and like fucking up my mental health considerably. And it's a great essay by a young trans woman. I forget her name. And she was like, look, I was raised in the church and it was horrible. And I went out and sought out like alternate spaces, and now it's just as horrible, essentially. But it's a very articulate breakdown of what you and I have been talking about this afternoon. I'll send it to you. It's a really good read. Excommunicate Me from the Church of Social Justice is the name of the essay.
Okay, yeah.
And it talks very much about what you've just, summarized, in that it's this religious dogma-like approach to progressive politics, which is really it's very fundamentalist,
Yeah, and it's funny because there's always this assumption that the progressive side is the right side, and it's like, it doesn't matter what the data says. Like, we don't care what the data says. We just know our politics are right.
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, I'm not willing to accept that assumption. Like, I'm going to need to look at the data myself.
It's a very rational worldview that you seem to have, where most people seem to be colored by emotion. Is that?
Yeah, that's true. A lot of people assume that progressive politics has something to do with love, connection, humanism, or whatever terms they throw around. And it's interesting because you'll see them use that language whilst they're engaged in like vicious call outs of people. And it's like, so what you're doing is essentially engaging in all of the things that you say conservatives do, and they're ruining the world, and conservatives are bullies, they're horrible, they're bigots, we've got to get rid of them, and you're doing the exact same thing, but you're calling it love, so we're meant to believe that. And I'm just not willing to believe that. I'm only willing to look at what, and I guess that's kind of psychology in a nutshell. Like, we look at tangible behaviors. It can't be based on the kind of whimsical, oh, but there's a sense of love, and it's like, but can we see that or measure it, or is there any tangible action attached to it? Because if not, it's just ideology. It doesn't actually mean anything.
How do you think we can stop racism and sexism and undo socioeconomic inequality and all that falls out of that, and still be kind?
Well, I think one of the interesting things I found through my PhD was that we might be talking about global problems, but we will be dealing with local solutions. We're not going to be able to wipe out racism across the globe by enforcing anti-racist, heavy-handed bullying of people that we think might be racist. That's not going to resolve racism. The same goes for sexism. The same goes for classism. Solutions are always local. And one of the really interesting things I found was that this kind of tension between groups of people, like the fact that we can't agree on what the solutions are, that's a solution in and of itself. Because when you get down to the community level and you're dealing with a small town and they need to come to a resolution, it's not going to be the thing that Donald Trump said or the thing that Barack Obama said or the thing that some other political leader said. It's going to be the solution they can find within that group of people who are specifically impacted, to find solutions within the tension that they have in their group. And so I think there's millions of solutions, and I think they're found in that kind of middle way between the different views of the different people who are affected. I just don't think, and I think this is a thing with people who are interested in social justice activism, and they're on the internet, and I think they might incorrectly, and this is a grandiosity thing, think that their view is relevant to the whole world. And because I'm anti-racist, the whole world needs to adopt this thinking. And that's, one, totally overblown grandiosity. Two, it's very ethnocentric. They tend to be American or Canadian or English views who are essentially exporting those views to other places. And three, other countries and other cultures and other groups of people are grappling with their own issues and coming up with their own solutions. And like, we can trust them to do that. Like, we don't have to force people to adopt our worldview to make the world a better place. We can let people have their process. So some of the solution is in actually just stepping back. Like, there's great organizations that can use support. I think Black Lives Matter has done a really great job of funding a lot of specific organizations that are doing specific things to deal with, the over-incarceration of Black Americans and those issues. But when it comes to like people who are just living their lives, I just don't think that yelling at people on the internet is a tangible solution. I don't think it's role modeling. If we want more kindness, we want more love, we need to be more kind and more loving. Like, yelling at people on the internet isn't more kind and more loving, it's less.
Yo, that's a brilliant answer. There's a lot I'd like to unpack, but I've taken an hour out of your day. Maybe we'll do. There's a lot more I want to talk about, like expanding definitions of words and like fucking all this sort of shit. But let's do this again sometime. We'll do a part 2.
Yes.
Okay. It's been wonderful, Dr. Laura. Thank you very, very much.
So awkward.
Anything,
Richie.
yeah. Well, yeah. Anything you want to finish on? Any like PSA you want to put out there?
I don't know. I don't think that the more kindness, more loving thing actually really represents my personality. Like I'm actually pretty upfront and blunt, and I don't kind of package things in like do loving kindness meditation. Like I'm very honest and real. I think people can be honest and real. But I also am aware that because my personality is very upfront and blunt, I have to be a bit careful. And I think that everyone's learning that now on social media. Like we have to be a bit more careful because no one wants to be bullied. So why would we perpetuate that behavior that we want to end?
I love that. It's a really good point. Thank you. We'll talk again.
Thank you.
Okay. Take good care.
You too.